Well, this is a real honor, Nate, that you would join this podcast and have this conversation with me. I know I overdo it a lot of times when I introduce you, and so I probably make you uncomfortable, but I also think that you chose that life. So if that's your resume, then I'm allowed to talk about it, is how I feel. But I'm talking to a genuine American hero. And I think, especially in today's age, somehow we've downplayed that, or we don't say it anymore. We don't talk about it existing. It used to exist in movies. It still does sometimes. We used to talk about it a lot more, I think, openly and with pride. But this is a man who was the leader of a team, part of a team, who rescued 7 POWs, who stormed Baghdad and Saddam's palace. You're going to correct me on all my factual mistakes.
You got it right so far. Keep going.
Okay, great. And did so much more. Harvard Business School, and we can go through all the list of great things you've done in the business world as well. But your book is called, which I've now read 1.5 times because I read another half time getting ready for this, but Running Toward Fire. And you truly in life, especially in service of our country, in service of me, when you didn't know me, ran for your brothers and sisters next to you, ran towards fire. And that's, I know, a life kind of North Star for you. But anyway, I'm delighted if you can't tell. And before I go much further,
I
I
am
want to give
too.
you
I
a
am too. I'm
chance.
delighted to be here. Thanks for
Good.
reconnecting. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself however you'd like to do that.
Yeah. So I think my most rewarding and difficult job is being the dad to 3 kids and 2 dogs. I'll include them as well. But I've got a 12-year-old Betsy, a 7-year-old Miguel, a soon to be 4-year-old Diego, happily married to a wonderful wife Marta, and then have 2 amazing dogs as well. And so it's chaos here in the Boaz Contreras household on a regular basis. So that's the most important stuff. I'm, call myself a man of faith. I'm on that spiritual journey like a lot of folks are, and I'm just trying to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, whatever that may be. So that's what I'd say about myself.
Well, I feel like you've done a lot with your life, so you just keep doing whatever you've been doing. I want to start at the beginning of the book where you start and you say, as we closed in on Saddam Hussein's palace, and you're going to have to give everybody a little context as I'm diving right in, but there's very few of us who have done something where, as you write, we could hear the bullets thudding against the fiberglass of our truck and whizzing through the high back cover of the RPGs rushed past us with a whoosh. And we were praying, please God, let us make it out alive. If you could, so I'm setting that very specific scene. So for everybody listening, you could just bring us into what it meant to serve, to be alongside the people you served with, and to eventually get to that moment. Because we talk about leadership, we talk about people, we talk about teams and what we can learn from that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was a most difficult moment in my life, one where I came the closest to feeling like that might be the end for me and for people that I really cared about and the team around me and other Marines, brothers who were fighting alongside me. If I roll back the tape a bit, I joined pre 9/11. So, what motivated me to go to Annapolis to serve in the Marine Corps was more about my World War II grandfathers who had served in World War II and had gone on to longer careers in the military. Had sort of instilled in me this idea that no matter what you do with your life, serve something or someone bigger than yourself, right? Like humble your ego and find that sense of meaning that you want to pursue and pursue it with all your passion. And that sort of drove me. Now, the world really narrows into the moment that you brought us into, and the cliche is there's no atheists in foxholes, but I truly believe that, in that moment, it was the wildest mix of emotions I think I've ever felt in my life. And I describe this in the book as, you know, being in hell and seeing some of the most beautiful sacrificial acts of humanity that you've ever experienced in your life. And it's hard to talk about it. I would use the analogy when I came back. It's like I went to Mars and only a handful of people went to Mars, and we can describe what Mars is like, but you have to go there yourself to see it, right? And to experience it. And so I struggled with talking about that for years. It was actually through working with my therapist that I came to this conclusion that I should talk about, more openly, what I experienced. And it's not just finding the silver lining in the storm, it's literally being a witness to watching these, and I'm going to get emotional, watching these young Marines who, love each other, genuinely love each other. And it is a kind of genuine love that's hard to describe. Not just doing what they're doing out of, sort of training, but running toward, machine gun fire. And you can see the enemy tracer rounds and running towards, enemy RPGs that are flying at them and exploding around them. And, leaving the safe comfort to the extent it is comfortable, but the safety of the armored vehicles that they're in, and leaving that willingly, right? Like, what does it take in one's? I don't think it's a mind thing. What does it take in one's heart and soul, to have the courage? It's not that there's not fear, and it's not that there's I'm invincible, right? I don't think anyone's convinced in those moments that they're invincible. They want to do what they believe is honorable out of a deep sense of love for whatever, and for a higher purpose. And so I feel very fortunate to have witnessed that, and even more fortunate to be able to come back and talk about it.
I work with executives, senior executives, and leaders about unlocking the full potential of the people in their organization, along the framework of what I call who, where, how being tactical, where strategy, but who is why do we exist? Who are we? What's our purpose? What's our values, our culture? When you unlock that, there's a cascade down and you've got full potential from these humans. I feel like what you just described is you got to see behind the veil. You got to see beyond, you got to see the full potential. And you said at that point, it isn't about what you're thinking, it's something about your spirit and your heart. Is there opportunity? Is it possible to even unlock that level of full human alignment, effort, and commitment in the business world?
I absolutely believe there is. And I think one of the biggest impediments, and I love what you're doing because it's actually overcoming that obstacle, is not talking about it. How taboo has it been? It was only in recent years that I ever heard, anyone talk about soul or spirit in work, right? And I've been in, places working on deep, like, leadership, personal transformation stuff, right? Where that was less taboo or more acceptable. But to bring that out to an organization, right? And to bring that out more broadly, and I worked in the HR departments of some major companies like Accenture and Microsoft, where even there, you could feel the discomfort people would have about talking about some deeper sense of meaning, and that would drive people beyond expectations, but also help them see something in themselves that, maybe they didn't see. And I think that's sort of been my, leadership mantra, is that it's my responsibility, duty, and great pleasure to help people live and lean into a potential that they might not otherwise see in themselves. And I think that's the work of leadership. And I think too many people see themselves as managers, where it's like, I've just got to get the job done, manage the process, not rock the boat. And that's, I think, one of the biggest limitations in organizations, is how people see themselves and their role in either igniting the organization to new levels of performance or just maintaining the status quo.
I talk to executives about shifting their thinking from viewing themselves as standing in the forest, almost equal with the line of sight, and elevating their thinking so that they're looking down on it, because then they become like the Tom Brady of whatever game they're playing, right? They can see all the moving pieces, they're calm, they're steady, they have no doubt they can move forward. And what you just said is, instead, we have a lot of leaders who, I'm not blaming them, I understand it can be scary out there, but they're de-risking
Yes.
as much as they possibly can.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of benefit for people to do I call it sadly the rest invest approach, right? There's a lot of benefit, right? Like think about what you're up against there, which is like I can keep doing what I'm doing. I can keep everybody happy. I can say all the right things in meetings. I can be, least disruptive, right? I can be, play along to get along, all that stuff, right? And I think that serves a lot of people really well from the standpoint of making a good salary and having, some relationships at work, good friends, whatever, right? Like, but at the end of the day, is that what, you want your legacy to be? That, he was a, Billy was a good employee. He showed up every day and he punched in and he punched out and he did what was asked of him. Yeah, thank you, Billy. Here's your watch for 30 years. Right? Like life is so much richer than that. Life is so much more than that if we say, don't you want to create something that makes this place better than the way you found it?
You say after that first page, like I'm on page 2 or 3 here. So, by the way, if you guys right, this is a 5-hour podcast. It's not, guys, don't worry. You need to read the book, though, everybody. You need to. I'm halfway into my second time through, and I did the second time through to prepare for this podcast, but I'm going to finish it because it is a great read. This is great writing. But on the second page, after talking about storming into Saddam's palace,
Yeah.
now we're in therapy. Many years later,
Right now we're in therapy.
right? And we are kind of now in
Me
there.
me
It's
and
it's
Bill out.
therapy for me, by the way, not you. For me, this is great.
Group therapy. Yeah.
What you say, and I don't know at what point in your professional career you thought I had traded a life of significance for a life of success, but just so everybody has the context, Nate, correct where I get the facts wrong, partner at McKinsey, COO for strategy at Accenture, managing director, investment committee at Rourke Capital, VP of global people strategy at Microsoft. And there's maybe something that I've missed. Now, having launched your own company, which we'll talk about, but you say at some point, and you say you're a therapist, and you tell us in the book that you trade a life of significance for success. And then the next page is, I needed answers. Who am I? Why am I here? And why do I still need to be here? And before I bounce the ball back to you, I'll say the best executives I've interviewed say every time they step into a role, they're asking, doesn't matter if they're the CEO or C level or SVP, why do we exist? Like the whole thing. That's my North Star. I need to know the answer to that. And if we haven't done the work, I'm happy to lead the work for our entire organization, but I have to understand why we exist. Can you take us through living a life of significance, then getting into that kind of swirl of confusion? Why am I here? And where you're at now, that whole process.
Yeah, the life of significance was one where, what motivates you, what gets you to jump out of the bed in the morning, what gets you to go work out 2 to 3 times a day and train in, miserable conditions, right? We would say revel in the suckiness of the experience, right? Like what motivates a human to, willingly, you know, volunteer for shared suffering, right? And it's got to be that it's not just that love trauma bonding, right? It's that you actually grow from doing hard things with other people, Like you become something that you didn't believe was possible. Like there's that old Marine Corps, you know, advertisement, recruiting commercial, of the guy with the sword slaying the dragon. It was like, I don't know, for me growing up, it was like one of those things that if it came on TV, I was just glued to the TV seeing this Marine, with a sword slaying a dragon. And it's symbolic of like going and slaying these personal dragons of disbelief I had about myself, like what I was able to do physically, morally, mentally, like what I was able to achieve. And I was never so challenged as I was at the Naval Academy and in the Marine Corps, maybe being a father and figuring that out because there's no book for that. But like literally, slaying these dragons of disbelief. And then, and doing it for very little pay. I mean, we completely underpay our people who serve in the military. I remember seeing my W-2 and my sort of, I guess the Social Security Administration shows you how much you made every year. And then like once I started working at McKinsey and I saw it, I was like, I think I'm paying as much in taxes at McKinsey as I made in a year or more, in the Marine Corps. Right. So just a small, plug there for, we should pay our military members more. But the life of success thing became like you could the biggest expense account and fly first class and eat at the nicest restaurants and stay at the fanciest hotels and live this life of luxury. And I'm not saying that McKinsey wasn't hard, but like in those environments, right, where the B school environment and the post B school environment where you know you 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 just sort of start to get comfortable with this idea that you deserve all of these things, and yet they're not earned. And so their level of satisfaction that you extract from them is minimal. At least it was for me. I feel like you start to try to fill the meaning gap with material things. And so that's what I mean about the significance to success is you're filling the meaning void in yourself in a life of significance with things that you love that are people or ideals or you know causes, right? And a life of success, you're trying to fill that same meaning void with food and alcohol and money and you know pleasure. And I just found it's not to say that everyone should become a monk and and not enjoy those things, but the level of enjoyment that you can get from them, I think, has to do with, is it helping you to grow or not? And if it's not helping you to become a better version of yourself. I talk about PRs a lot, with my daughter, with my kids, with friends at work, right? Are you doing better than your personal record, right? Are you besting yourself? Don't look at, everyone else. Comparison is the thief of joy, I think Teddy Roosevelt said, but like, are you living a life where today I feel like I'm a better version of myself than I was yesterday? And that's what I think provides the most satisfaction, at least from my perspective, than it does if you're like, I'm just going to, eat all I can, drink all I can, consume all I can. And, he with the most, toys, he who dies with the most toys wins, but he still dies. And all that you can leave, behind is what you've given away while you were here. So, that's to me, that's the difference between significance and success.
And then how do we help leaders? Let's say they're responsible for 1,000 people, 5,000 people, 100 people
Yeah.
at corporations lead from significance and help form their teams, their functions, their organizations into a collective group that is pursuing significance, not just success when we have all these OKRs, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up OKRs and their team and everything, because that's the place that I see most leaders jump to, is they immediately want to jump to, Billy, if I only had the right team, or if I could work out these top team dynamics, or if you could, help me think about, is this the right person for this role? Or maybe I need to make some moves. Or if we only had that one killer metric, could you help us come up with the killer metric that all, metrics feed into? Or maybe if we simplified our scorecard, or could we get that made into a dashboard? If I only had the right dashboard, we could be driving this thing in the right direction. And I'm like, whoa, 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 back up. And there's this thing that stuck with me for the longest time when I was doing leadership development work, starting with deep work on myself at McKinsey. And I don't know if you've heard of this guy. He wrote a book and did this sort of amazing TED talk at Davos a long time ago, named Ben Zander. He was a music conductor, composer. And he was talking to all these senior leaders at Davos. So, right, like very bougie, but like the top of the top organizations and everything. And he was trying to land this point about, like, none of that other stuff matters if you aren't showing up differently. If you as the leader, right? And so that's what I would back up to, right? We had this framework at McKinsey, right? Like lead self, lead others, lead organization, lead transformation, right? And so people want to skip to like leading team, leading others, leading the organization, leading transformation. And they're completely, they want the world around them to change, but they don't want to change themselves. And the unlock is that by you changing yourself, you're the tip of the end of the bullwhip, right? Like of the handle, right? And if you make that small adjustment, it's going to be huge downstream. You won't even know how big of a change downstream it's going to be. And so what Ben Sanders said was this quote that stuck with me, which is, who am I being that the light of their eyes are shining? Right? Who am I being that the light of their eyes are shining? Right? And, people say the eyes are the window into the soul. Right. And so, if you go find this old video clip of Ben Zander at Davos, he's like running around, like he's this, kind of has this like Einstein like hair, and he's a funny looking guy, but he's getting in the faces of these business executives and he's looking them deep in the eyes and he's saying, ask yourself, who am I being that the lights of their eyes are shining? And that always stuck with me as like, that's the first question, something like that. Who am I? Who are you showing up as? Because so much of what you're seeing around you and your dysfunctional team dynamics and the organization's, bureaucracy and slowness and resistance to change, so much of what you're seeing can be attributed back to how you are showing up as a leader. Anyway, and that's not an indictment. That's not an indictment on anyone. That was an awakening I had for myself, in terms of like, if I'm not getting the outcome that I want, it's like what Narcotics Anonymous said, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome is the definition of insanity. Well, you showing up every day and expecting your team and organization to change and transform without you changing and transforming is the definition of insanity.
I love that, because what I hear you saying is, before we're going to go, uh, and I work with organizations to do it together. If it's 1,500 people, I say everybody gets a voice, not a vote, but a voice. I want to hear from them. We're going to define this purpose, vision, and mission together. But before you even go do that work and say, why do we exist? Are you doing the work to answer, why do I exist? Why am I here? Why am I at this organization? Why am I getting up in the morning? Can you talk a little bit about Howard Henry Digman? Reading the book I thought this would be a man I'd love to sit in his presence, because you had your hair shaved by him many times before you realized that he shaved Marines' hair for decades, but also won 2 Bronze Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, the French Medal of Freedom. Was he on the beaches of Normandy? Yes. What's it like to sit in his presence? What's your learnings from him? Take us into that chair.
If I describe how it was. I don't know how it is now, but at the Naval Academy, right? Like there were very specific standards, just like the Marine Corps, on like how you could keep your hair, right? Like, didn't have to be a high and tight, but like, you know, how it had to be trimmed over the ears, the length it could be on the top, how much could come out the back, right? Like there was very specific standards for everything, facial hair, right? It had to be within regs, right? Within regulations. And so, included in your sort of pittance of a pay, you know, as a midshipman was, you could go get haircuts at this barber shop. And there was, four or five barbers. Imagine, old school chairs lined up, and it was about turnover. Get them in there, get them out. It wasn't like, the barbershop movie or, any of these places where like we're all just, hanging out and, shooting the breeze and all that stuff. So, you didn't have a whole lot of time to talk to the barber, but I remember I always liked, Dig cutting my hair because he was really good, and he'd line everything up, and he would, use that sort of old school, I forget what it's called, but like the alcohol based stuff to clean you up and make sure you didn't get the razor bumps and all that stuff. And so, and the powder and the brush. I mean, I don't remember if he actually brought a razor out, but like he was really good.
It was his art.
Yeah, it was his art. I mean, like, I didn't know at the time, but he had been barbering for, I think, 30 or 40 years when he finally retired. But like when I was there, he had probably been barbering for, 20 years or something like that, right? Older gentleman, you can see the photo of him in the book, cutting hair before he retired. And there was just this one day where I thought to ask about the photograph that was on his, counter there, right? Because, most barbers or hairdressers, they have a little bit of personal stuff in their space. And he had this photo. It was this black and white, photo of like, all these guys in uniform, and they looked super young. Like, some of them looked like they weren't even 18, right? And probably weren't. Some of them probably lied on, how old they were so that they could go. And I couldn't really make out like what unit it was, but it looked like Army. They looked like they had the doughboy uniforms on with the, um, the pointy hats and whatnot. And I asked him, I said, Dig, you know, who is that? Who's in that photo? And he's like, I'm in that photo, and those are all the guys I went to like high school with and grew up with in Maryland. And that was the unit I was with that, ended up going over in World War II. And I was like, well, where were you? What'd you see? Like, and he said, we were on the second wave of storming the beaches of Normandy on Omaha Beach. And I'm like, oh, shit. Like, really? And you're here? Like, I kind of know, I was a poli sci major, but I took a lot of history courses, and I was a big, student of especially World War II history, with both of my grandfathers having served. Now they were in the Army Air Corps, so they weren't on the ground in those places, but they saw action too. And I asked him what it was like, and he started getting into like, hey, look, do you know this movie, Saving Private Ryan is coming out? 'Cause it wasn't out yet, it was coming out soon. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's got, Matt Damon. I like him. And Tom Hanks. I like him. It's got all these good actors that I really like, in it. He said, I advised on that movie. And I'm like, really? And he's like, yeah, and you're going to find, cause I think he'd seen a screening or, had seen some of the initial stuff of the beach landing. And he said, it was really hard for me to watch, to relive some of that. And he's like, but it's the most accurate depiction, I've ever seen of what actually happened. But there's a little bit of stuff they left out that's probably too gruesome for people to see. And I was like, Dig, well, what are you talking about? And he was like, well, most of the people in that photo didn't make it back. And he was like, and being on the second wave, I'm not saying it was worse than the first wave. Definitely the first wave took the most casualties. But here's the thing about being on the second wave. You saw all the casualties of the first wave, and you're getting off the boat, seeing all of your dead brothers floating in the water on the beach. Um, and you're trying to climb the same hills and make the same ground that they died on, and try to go just a little bit further. And I'm stunned in silence, right? How old am I? I don't know, 21, like, and about to, embark on my life in the Marine Corps. And here's this guy, telling me these stories. And he said the one thing that they left out, um, the one thing that they left out was that there were so many landmines and obstacles and everything that we didn't have, you know, way to make sure that the next 5 feet in front of us didn't have a landmine on it. And so we were literally having to take the dead bodies of our fallen brothers and move them up in front of us and walk on their backs with the hope that their bodies would absorb the explosion of a landmine and minimize the shrapnel to us as we moved 5 feet forward to advance the line. Yeah, I don't know how I like got up from that chair. I don't even remember, but that was like seared into my memory, him talking through that. And I remember going to the movie and thinking about him during that whole opening scene. And I called my mom about it, like to tell her, and she went to see it and she had to walk out of the theater in the opening scene because if you remember, it's like, I mean, Tom Hanks made sure it was as real as possible. He's a big student of World War II and supporter of like all of our veterans, especially from that time period. And yeah, I couldn't imagine what it was like to go through, talk about running through fire. What's going through a young man who, was just in high school in Maryland, now on this boat halfway around the world, getting out of that boat under fire, wading to the shore while bodies float past you that are stacked up on the shore and thinking, I'm going to make it up this hill, with these pillboxes of, Nazi machine gun fire raining down on me. And yet he did. And he brought back those stories.
Is it too far of a stretch to think that we can aspire to bring that level of humility as he's cutting hair and not telling that story for decades unless you ask, and also that level of service above self into leadership, into our teams, into our families? Or is there just not an opportunity because we're not facing Nazi fire?
I mean, it's interesting you brought up humility in the face of like how he's lived his life after that. And then, this story of just tremendous, courage in the face of like, unimaginable danger and adversity, life-threatening, danger and adversity. People have asked me, and I've, posited before that there's sort of they've asked me, what, if you could come up with one leadership trait that's in, sort of the trait above all other traits, and I've always said I can't come up with one, but I can try to come up with two that work in tandem with each other, and they're courage and humility. Um, and so, and I think it starts with humility. I mean, everyone says chicken or egg. I think it starts with humility, and the humility to admit to oneself that you don't know everything, that you need others, that we're on this, this blue ball spinning through space, to love one another, to love ourselves and to love one another and to love, our God or whoever we believe in, right? And that no one is better than anyone else, right? And that universal connection that we have with each other, right? And so that all plays into humility in my mind, which is just accepting our equal status as human beings, that everyone has value, right? And so that's the great, you know humbling mindset, I think, that then opens you up to tremendous opportunity and growth. Because if you fancy yourself the best or an expert or a know-it-all, right? That immediately disconnects you from everyone else. And it disconnects you from opportunity because like no one wants to work with that person that isn't open. And then the courage side of it is to then lean into and step into the discomfort and the unknown with a belief. You have to have some kind, and this is where the spiritual belief comes in. You have to believe that there's something on the other side of this adversity, or maybe it's not even on the other side of it. I didn't say that exactly how I want to. There's something through this adversity that is going to benefit others and the world. And so it's worth doing. It's worth dying for, right? Um because it's not like you're, hey, look, if I make this, I can't wait to get that, French medal, or I can't wait to get that. No one's sitting there saying, oh, man, I would really love to get the Medal of Honor, right? Usually the Medal of Honor comes posthumously. No one's sitting there saying, like, that's why I'm doing this. I think what your courage, I think, means full-heartedness. I think the root of the word, and that's what I think about when I think about courage, is that your heart is so full of love for something beyond yourself that you're willing to step into a dangerous unknown, that could even be life threatening. And, I can talk more about it, but I do think that humility and courage don't just apply to combat situations. And, I think humility and courage, you know, are extremely important leadership traits, no matter if you're, in a small business, in a small team, or a big organization. I think those are traits that really help move organizations toward, you know, unimaginable new levels of performance, and, people willing to go above and beyond expectations.
Is good. The basic school is for Marine officer, I think, training, Quantico, Virginia. This is the best of the best. It's hard for me to even conceive. You also graduated, if we want to keep going down the resume, from Harvard Business School, but and the Naval Academy, right? Yeah. But the way you paint the picture, competing against and with alongside these others at the basic school, is competing against some of the best in the world. And depending on how well you do, determines your ability to decide what you do long term with the Marines. Your friend, was number one in military skills, which I'm sure it is not at all easy. But as a civilian, think about it, I think, okay, that's something I can measurably, I can get reps on, right? I can shoot the gun enough. I can do the whatever enough and maybe to be the best. You were number one in leadership. When I read that, I said, what reps are you doing? Are you looking in the mirror every morning saying, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough? No, you're not. So how are they measuring leadership? And I would love you to take us back to that place, because your whole career has been leadership, global people strategy for Microsoft, right? COO strategy, people strategy, Accenture, etc. So in that moment, at least, because I think specific examples can be more powerful to our learning than broad principles. So in the basic school, at that age especially, would not having the benefit of all of the experience you have to this day, what were the key elements and maybe even an example story that set you apart, where some of the best leaders in the world who made that decision decided that you were number one?
Yeah, well, thank you. It is one of the things I'm sort of most proud of in my career, because, so many things are sort of an individual decision that people make. And this was one where it was literally not just voted on, it was evaluations from all my peers on my squad, in my platoon, in the basic school company that I was in. Everyone sort of ranked and evaluated, everyone else, right? And you're all, peer second lieutenants in the Marine Corps, right? Going through this training together. So, you know, um, and there aren't really cliques, right? This is not, middle school or high school where there's a group like, hey, let's get together and vote for Nate. Yeah, vote for me. Like, it's not like you're running for student office. It's literally, hey, I'm hardcore evaluating you, Billy, and you're hardcore evaluating me. And then all of that's aggregated. And then, the score at the end. I mean, they force ranked us on everything: academics, military skills, leadership assessments, all that stuff. And they would post them, right? And we'd go out to the hallways, and look at where where we racked and stacked, in those things. And then overall, because it determined like what job you would get, right? And so people really cared about it. Am I going to be a supply officer or an infantry officer, a tank officer, an intelligence officer? All that, be determined by how well you did or how poorly you did. For me, and I'll say there was like this 2-week exercise. I think they called it the war, like where we literally, dug foxholes, lived out in the woods for 2 weeks. It's a lot of field exercises because they're, you know, every Marine Corps officer has to do it. And it's unique in the Marine Corps where, like, no other service requires their officers to go to 5 to 6 months of training before they can go lead Marines. And because leading Marines is a very special thing. And, the basic school really focuses on how do we make these, raw officers leaders of Marines, with the competency, to do that, and some experience. And so it's 5 to 6 months in the woods of Quantico, lots of time out in the field. And I'll never remember, like, we were Arctic Alpha, so it was like in the winter, and no matter if it's in Virginia or not, you're never colder than you are when you're wet, and it was pissing on us literally, while we're out in the and you don't have enough, you've waterproofed all your gear, but you don't have enough socks and you don't have enough clothes to not get wet and for stuff to dry out. You're literally putting your boots in your sleeping bag to hope that your body heat helps dry them out, dry your socks out. But we were wet and miserable. There were people getting hypothermia, getting pulled out of the field. And my approach was lift everyone up, you know, go from foxhole to foxhole when everyone's, you know, at their lowest, you know, tell them a joke, give them a smile, encouragement, right? Like, I love that word because I've always found that when you're in a tough place, a place where you feel like, give up, it's someone else, it's a helper that comes along and gives you a bit of encouragement that gets you over that hump. And so I didn't see it as a competition either. And that's a big thing because I think a lot of my peers saw some of these things as like, I'm going to best everyone else, right? I'm going to beat everyone else versus I'm going to make sure that we all do better than we thought we were going to do. The we versus the me, right? And so to me, that's at the essence of leadership, which is, I'm thinking about the troops, the Marines, the team, and how I can help them lift themselves up, right? It's not just like and get in the foxhole with them. I love that, sort of, it's not just a metaphor. I literally did, right? Someone's standing in a muddy, full of water foxhole, staring out at the trees, waiting for the enemy to come attack, miserable. And, you're their platoon commander. I'm going to get in the foxhole with you and I'm going to look you in the eye and I'm going to feel the pain with you, but I'm also going to, be your, cheer you along and, say, yeah, this sucks. Like, acknowledge it. Yeah, this sucks. And we're in this suckiness together and we're going to come out the other side of this better than we came into it. And never losing that fundamental belief in your people. And so that's what I think I did. And I've continued to try to do that. It's not always worked. I think there's a lot of places where, competition reigns supreme. And in those places, it's tough to lead people. It really is, you know, when they think the goal is go ahead.
It's good to hear that from you because I think it gives the rest of us hope when we're feeling it. If it's hard for you, then I think
Well,
we get it.
it's never been easy. I've, not been a fit at a couple of the places that I've worked, and I'm not shy about saying that. And a lot of that has to do with me, probably more to do with me than those places. I will just acknowledge that, when you're in an environment or a culture where people believe that the job is to, either maintain the status quo, that's a hard place to lead and work, or when people believe, the job is to prove that you're better than everyone else, that's also a hard place.
Yeah, culture
Yeah.
is king. Let's talk about, well, I'm going to ask you to talk about rescuing 7 POWs. Can you help us common people understand just how big a deal that is, and then take the people who haven't read the book through the story, and of course, also just learnings from the story, what we would take away?
Yeah. Allow me, if you don't mind, and thank you for asking about it, because I think it's the one of the greatest, war stories never told, or never told, correctly. And I can
We need
get
a
that.
movie. I wanna say
Yeah.
we need a movie.
Oh, we're
Anybody
we're working
listening?
on that. We're working on that. We actually are working on that, and we'll see. And I hope it does get told in the right way. People who were around during that time, 2003, probably remember the story of Jessica Lynch, which was a tragic, you know, uh, thing that happened. And then the response, was not great. And I don't want to go too far into that, because that's where a lot of the focus went at the time, was to, Jessica Lynch, misnaming her as a hero, which she came out and said, I'm not a hero. What others did was, and then, her rescue being seen as like this amazing thing, which, I don't want to downplay that, but you know, it, it was very sort of routine and overplanned, right? I'll just say that. So that's what people remember. What they didn't hear about, and what happened was, what in context is the greatest POW rescue since World War II, most successful, everyone was rescued, is back alive, is living full lives. Some of them had kids at the time, some of them have had kids since, and that's a highlight that will be a highlight of my life, but just an amazing, story of how we leave no one behind, right? That is a deep part of the warrior ethos in the US military. And, I think it's a shining example of that being lived out. So here's what happened. In the early days of the initial conflict in Iraq in 2003, so around 20 March is when 1920 March is when things kicked off. A few days later, this unit, the one that Jessica Lynch was a part of, the 507th Maintenance Unit, they didn't think that they were going to be in combat. They were supposed to provide support, to this missile defense unit in the Army. End up driving past the Marine front lines and into enemy territory and get ambushed. And I think 11 soldiers were killed. It kicked off this Marine fight in Nasiriyah way before it was supposed to get kicked off, right? So it snowballed into all of these things. Jessica Lynch was captured and taken to a hospital because she was knocked unconscious. Lori Piestewa, who's the first Native American female to ever die in combat with the U.S., was tragically killed there, along with 10 other soldiers. And what people didn't talk about was there was 5 other Army soldiers, including Shoshana Johnson, who's the first African American female POW, and then 4 other males were taken. They were not treated well. They were beaten. They were dragged through the streets. They were paraded around. They were put on TV. There's clips from, which is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. Al Jazeera and Iraq TV both broadcast around the world that, they had these 5 American POWs. Shoshana had been shot. Joe Hudson had been shot. Edgar Hernandez had been shot. So these people had active bleeding wounds, and were, yes, they treated some of the wounds, but they were also abusing them. So it was, just a very scary situation for them. And they got carted off to Baghdad. I think that was March 21st, 22nd. A couple of days later, or actually the next night, over Karbala, I think it was like 32 Apache helicopters were going on a mission to take out an Iraqi group of tanks ahead of time. And the Iraqis, did some pretty interesting stuff. They shut off all the lights and then they brought them all on at once and sort of blinded the night vision goggles of all these Apache pilots. They shot at a bunch of the aircraft. Most of the aircraft were damaged, and one of them got shot down. And that one had Dave Williams and Ronald Young in it, two warrant officers in the Army who got shot down. They crash landed in the field, and then they started to evade. Dave Williams was SEER trained, so he knew, survival, evasion, rescue type stuff. And they started running and evading and were hiding in, all muddy in a creek. And then, finally some local Iraqi militia found them and outnumbered them with weapons and captured them. Same thing. Beat them, paraded them through the streets, and put them on TV. So there's also, film footage of that from the time. And then brought them to Baghdad. So 5 plus 2, that's the 7. We call them 7 Nightingales because Nightingale is like the call sign for an American POW. And they were carted off to Baghdad and moved around like 8 times to different prisons. My unit, we hear about the capture of the 5th. We hear about the capture of the pilots. We're tracking this and we're looking for, WMD. We're looking for enemy positions, but we're also looking for our American POWs. We get to Baghdad and we get intelligence from some of the people that we're interrogating there that they're being held in a prison very close to the palace that we're in. And a special unit went to go try to rescue them and they weren't there, but they could tell that they had been there. Dave Williams had scratched his initials DW into the wall, which is sort of like a leave behind SEER technique thing to say, hey, look, if somebody's coming to find us and they want evidence that we're here, they were. And the scary thing is as we took Baghdad, we almost killed them with friendly fire, because we were bombing the city and taking all these buildings and everything. They got carted out in a Red Crescent ambulance during the battle for Baghdad in this wild careening, they almost died in the ambulance. If you ask the POWs, there was gunfire from both sides that they were driving through. Again, a violation of the Geneva Conventions because we're not allowed to stop an ambulance if it's the other side's ambulance or medical treatment from the other side to people. And so, it was a pretty interesting technique by the Iraqis. They took them to this town of Samarra and divine providence or whatever you want to call it. But the couple of days later, I get a call from, this guy, General Kelly's group. That General Kelly, who became the Secretary of Homeland Security and then the Chief of Staff to the President. He was a 1-star general at the time and had this task force Tripoli and said, come north, set up, with our unit here. And we need, intelligence collection. I had some of the only translators and we were doing, a lot of good work. We were pretty scared, if I'm honest, right? We had just survived all that Baghdad stuff. And so we went with this unit, 3rd Light Armor Reconnaissance Unit, to provide screening between Baghdad and Tikrit while they went after Saddam and his family, and to keep people from going in and out of Samarra, which is this sort of holy city where people believe the Tower of Babel was built. It's interesting place. And we so we're parked outside of there and we're screening all these folks, and my team starts getting information that our POWs might be held in Samarra. And long story short, we vet this through multiple sources. Guy on my team who's my co-founder and close friend now, we've been friends for 26 years now. He takes my GPS device and trains this guy to go get an exact grid coordinate of the location. It's 2.1 miles away from where we're standing. He negotiates because the source that we had was the uncle of one of the guards, and he didn't want his nephew to be killed by the Marines. They thought we were all going to go into Samarra. We didn't have permission to go into the city. We didn't have comms with higher headquarters. I mean, it was like something out of a movie in that sense, where I remember being on the radio and breaking all radio protocol and getting profane. I'm like, somebody find Colonel Clarity, the battalion commander, and get his ass down here right now. Here I am, this, young first lieutenant screaming on the radio that the battalion commander needs to come here. Because I thought it was a very time sensitive life, threatened situation where, talking to the POWs afterwards, they thought they had their last supper. They thought that they were going to get killed as a part of sort of nobody wants to be caught with the hot potato, right? At the end of the, you know, you know, when the music stops, you want to have a chair. And all those folks were afraid that, the regime was going to kill them if they didn't kill the POWs, and the POWs were scared that these guards were going to kill them. So we, time sensitive. And unlike the Jessica Lynch situation, which was days of planning and special forces and coordination with the Pentagon and senior officials and everything, this was a battalion of Marines in the middle of nowhere with the time sensitive information and intelligence that could have been taking them into an ambush. And I remember the colonel asking me, like, he's standing there, and he was this John Wayne, sort of skinny John Wayne type character, Colonel Clarity. He went on to be a 3-star general, by the way, but he's standing there and he looks at me and he's like, son or lieutenant or whatever he called me. He's like, how confident are you there? And I'm like, I'm sure they're there, sir. We've got to go. Like, we've got multiple sources. We've got the grid coordinate, but it could be an ambush. And I'm also worried about that, right? I'm conflicted. Like, I want us to go get them, but like, I could be the one that's telling them to go into this like really bad situation and pushing them into it. And with a grin on his face, like, this sorry, but shit-eating grin on his face, he's just smirking at me. And he's like, Lieutenant, what's the worst thing that can happen? We get shot at, and that's what Marines get paid to do, right? Like straight out of like, some kind of, movie. He says that to me, and it was like, giddy up, we're going. And so they put together a team. I sent Randy, who's the guy who got the information and the negotiation, Rod, who's one of my interpreters. And then we set up a location to debrief them on the way back. So I'm monitoring the radio the whole time. And they, there was some twists and turns. There was a guy that ran at them with an RPG, saw the firepower that the Marines brought and dropped it and ran away, right? They got a bit lost because this was in the heart of this city. Not a big city, but like, there's all kinds of buildings and offices and apartment buildings. And so they're looking for this apartment building. They have a hand-drawn map. I put it in the book, from the source, the grid coordinate. This was not when you had like simple GPS, like find my friends, find this location, right? This was like, okay, it had a little arrow on it and said, you're getting closer, hot, cold,
Turn
whatever.
right at the big chicken.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so they get close. And again, whether you believe in a higher power or not, Dave Williams had at that moment permission to go on the roof to go like hang up his clothes to dry out. And so Dave is on the roof and sees the Marines surrounding the building and is like waving. Then they find the ambulance parked out front and they see a brown Army t-shirt on the back of the ambulance. And then they know it's it. And so they go kick in the door, storm the room, get everyone down, right? Which was a part of the thing. We said, hey, look, if the guards put their weapons away, don't resist, don't fire back, we will treat them, appropriately. Plus, if they didn't like abuse these prisoners or do anything like that, we separate the POWs from the Iraqi guards. Randy goes in and talks to the guards, talks to the POWs. These guys hadn't abused them. They were like the best guards that they had had. They were the last ones that they had had. So we let them go. We kept our promise. Let those guards go. They asked if they could have their weapons back afterwards because they were scared for their lives. Randy agreed to that, got the POWs out, got them in the vehicle, got them back to the location we were at. And over the radio, 7 Nightingales inbound. And I'm like, say again, 7 Nightingales inbound over. They'd been rescued. We debriefed them for a few hours before they went back to Kuwait, Germany, and then eventually back to the US. We were the first ones to tell them that Jessica Lynch was still alive and had been rescued. She had been rescued, I think, on April 1st. This was April 13th. The 2 pilots ended up having, Easter Sunday service in Texas with President Bush and First Lady Laura Bush. So they were back by Easter, and we kind of went back to our job, right? Like, so it was like this, there's no fanfare, there's no ticker tape parade, but the most sort of meaningful thing was once the operations were over, those main operations were over, and we were back to the division headquarters. This guy named Jim Mattis, you might have heard of him. He was the first Marine Division general at the time. He asked for a private meeting with just my team. And he sat down with us to hear the whole story firsthand, for well over an hour, and to thank individually each member of my team for everything that they had done. Um, and I'm a bit emotional about it because, people talk about like you know, what's the reward for doing something like this, or like what's the acknowledgement, or whatnot, and that alone was probably the most meaningful thing that could have happened, right? Not some award, not some big newspaper article about it, but just to have the guy that was, I think one of the best leaders I've ever served with or known in my entire career, spend time personally thanking us for what we had done. And so I think my lesson from that is if you're a leader of an organization or a team and you're thinking about like, you know, should I give them some more points so that they can pick out something online, or should I give them a gift card from Starbucks, or like, no, spend time with them, telling them how much what they did meant to you and meant to the mission and meant to the overall success of the operation. And I've been in touch with Mattis since then. Like, I sent him the book because there's some stories I include about him in the book, and it started this whole dialogue. He was like emailing me back and just thankful that, like, wanted to stay in touch and make sure that the things were accurate that I put in the book, right? And to me, that's the essence of at the essence of leadership is, showing people how much you appreciate and love the service and the sacrifice and the things that they did. There's no better reward than that.
I know we're at time, but if you
Yeah.
get 2 more minutes, will you tell us about Prometheus Intelligence and what you've Microsoft, Accenture, Rourke Capital, McKinsey. Now I'm going to launch my own company.
Yeah.
What are you guys doing? What are you excited about?
Yeah, so this is our logo. You mentioned that before we got on, and the quick story about, Prometheus. He was a Titan. He wasn't a god. He's the one that stole fire from Zeus and gave it back to humanity, which was sort of like the original technology. And I believe, that we need to give people technology in the right way to illuminate things, right? And what we're trying to do at Prometheus Intelligence is illuminate the truth, which in this world of misinformation and disinformation, and everything can be fake depending on your perspective, it's a really tough thing to do. But we focus in on what Randy, my co-founder, and I learned in our training as counterintelligence and human intelligence Marines, which is if you ask really good questions, you can get better answers. And so what we've done is we've built an AI software that tries to take as much of the human bias and out of the process, to interview people for investigative interviews. We're not really focused on hiring, but investigative interviews. It turns any police officer, soldier, intelligence collector, security professional into an expert investigative interviewer in any language, anywhere. And so, we're working with AI models and agentic systems that really help people ask other people better questions to get better answers to make better decisions. And at the core of it is the ability to ask really good questions dynamically without bias, and gather information from humans that's going to help you make, faster decisions, but higher quality decisions.
And back to what we talked about, I'll just ask the big question. Why does Prometheus Intelligence exist? Why are you doing it? Why does it matter so much to you?
Yeah, I mean, I deeply believe that this has to be built and created in this world to help people sort through just all the information and noise and everything, and get a clear signal so that we, you know, keep the innocent innocent, judge the guilty correctly guilty, right? I'm deeply motivated by this notion that there's a lot of sort of, I won't just call them bad decisions, there's a lot of misjudgments that are made. And if I can help get people the right information to avoid some of these misjudgments, I think that'll be a better world that we'll be living in, because I would feel a tremendous sense of guilt and like I didn't do my job if I ever, played a part in convicting the wrong person or, letting the person go that had actually, committed the crime or had, done something wrong. And so that's what we hope to do. There's a lot of things out there that end up leading people down the wrong path, right? A lot of technologies that have existed for a long time and a lot of approaches. And our hope is that by illuminating the truth, it will set you free.
I love that. Nate, such an honor. Incredible stories, incredible impact. You've made the world a safer, better place for all of us, and that's not hyperbole. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Billy, for the opportunity. I really appreciate it and keep doing what you're doing, man.